The letter had promised her a future. What it had never promised was the truth. Ada Fairchild stood in the doorway of the farmhouse with her carpetbag dropped at her feet and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and she was staring at the man who had written to her for 6 months without ever once mentioning that the homestead she had come to claim was not broken at all. The fence posts were straight. The roof was sound. The garden beside the house was neat and deliberate, rows of late summer vegetables pulling green from the hard Texas earth, and there were curtains in the windows, clean ones, pale yellow, the kind a person puts up when they care deeply about something. The barn behind the house was freshly whitewashed. There were chickens in a proper coop. There was a water pump that looked like it had been recently fitted with new iron hardware. None of it matched the letters. In every one of those letters, Theodore Watkins had described a place barely holding itself together. He had written about a leaking roof with the kind of weariness that made a person believe it. He had described fences that needed mending, soil that needed turning, a property that was too much for one man and would take 2 people willing to work themselves half to death just to survive the winter. He had never once described curtains. He had never once described whitewash. And he was standing in front of her now, this Theodore Watkins, tall and broad-shouldered and weather-darkened, with brown eyes that held something she could not immediately name, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been waiting for so long that the waiting had become a part of his daily breathing, and he was not saying a word. "You lied to me," Ada said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Every letter. You lied to me in every single letter." His jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his cheek. He pulled his hat off his head and held it in both hands in front of him, which was a gesture that might have looked humble on a smaller man, but on him looked more like a man bracing himself for something he had already accepted was coming. "Not about the things that matter," he said. "You told me the roof leaked. It did leak, 3 years ago. You told me the fences needed mending. They did need mending. I mended them." Ada felt something hot and sharp move through her chest, equal parts fury, and something she was not ready to examine yet. Then why write it as though it still needed doing? Why write it as though you needed someone to come save this place? Why write to the Widows and Unmarried Women's Registry at all if you didn't actually need? She stopped herself. Because the answer was already forming in the silence between them, written in the way he was holding her gaze and refusing to look away. He had not written to the registry because he needed someone to help fix a homestead. He had written because he had already fixed it, and he wanted someone worth fixing it for. That realization did not soften her anger. If anything, it complicated it in a way that made her feel off balance, like the ground beneath her had shifted slightly to the left, and she needed a moment to find her footing again. She picked up her carpetbag. "I need to think," she said, and she walked past him into the house before he could answer. The inside was worse than the outside, meaning it was worse because it was better, meaning every corner of it was evidence of a man who had been quietly, patiently, stubbornly preparing a home for someone he had not yet met. The floors were swept. There was a braided rug in front of the hearth. The kitchen shelves held a reasonable store of staples, flour and cornmeal and dried beans, arranged in clean crockery jars. There was a rocking chair near the window that caught the afternoon light, and it had a cushion on it, a handmade one, filled with what she later learned was cotton batting he had combed himself. Ada set her bag down on the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. She had come here expecting to find a broken thing that needed her practical hands and her resilient spirit and her willingness to work hard in exchange for land and a livelihood and a way forward after everything she had lost in Missouri. She had expected a man who needed saving as much as the land did. She had not expected this. She had not expected him. She needed to go back to the beginning to understand how she had arrived here, in this kitchen that smelled of pine soap and beeswax, with a stranger's kindness pressing in on her from every clean-swept corner, and a man standing in her doorway who had kept a beautiful homestead for someone worth keeping it for. The beginning was cold and gray and smelled of grief. It was the winter of 1874, and Ada Fairchild had just buried her father in the rocky soil of Callaway County, Missouri, in a churchyard that had taken in more Fairchilds than she cared to count. Her mother had gone 7 years before, taken by a fever that swept through the county like a judgment. Her brother Thomas had gone to the war in '62 and come back in '64 as a different man, quieter and more frightened behind the eyes, and he had spent the following decade slowly drinking himself into an early grave, which he had found in the spring of '73. And now her father, Elias Fairchild, who had been the last fixed point in Ada's world, who had farmed and prayed and argued with the county tax assessor, and loved his surviving daughter with a fierce and stubborn tenderness, was gone too. She was 26 years old and she had no family left, and the farm her father had owned was mortgaged to a man in Jefferson City who had been waiting with considerable patience for Elias Fairchild to stop living so that the patience could pay off. Ada was not a woman given to despair. She had learned early that despair was a luxury that the poor and the working could not afford to indulge in for long, so she allowed herself 3 days of genuine grief, 3 days of not eating much and sleeping a great deal, and sitting in her father's chair, and feeling the absence of him like a missing tooth you keep pressing your tongue against in disbelief. Then on the 4th day she got up and made herself a proper breakfast and sat down at the table with a piece of paper and the stub of a pencil and started listing her options. She could stay in Missouri and find work. There was work for women in Fulton, domestic work, laundry, teaching if she could get a position. She could stay and scrape and survive, or she could go west. The West had been calling to people like her for years, offering land and space, and the chance to build something from scratch that belonged to no one's bank and no one's history except your own. She had read the pamphlets. She had heard the stories. She knew the stories were not all true and that the West was harder than the pamphlets pretended, but she also knew that hard was not a thing that frightened her, because hard was the only thing she had ever known. The Widows and Unmarried Women's Registry for Western Territories had been operating out of a church organization in St. Louis since 1868, connecting women who needed a new start with men in the territories who had land and stability but lacked companionship. It was not a mail-order bride service, not exactly, though it had some of the same bones. It was more of a structured correspondence arrangement, where both parties wrote letters for a period of time before any decisions were made, and the church organization served as a kind of intermediary and moral guarantor, ensuring the men were who they said they were, and the women understood what they were agreeing to consider. Ada had written to the registry in February of 1874, 6 weeks after burying her father. She had filled out the forms honestly, listing her age and her health and her skills, which were considerable, covering farming and preservation and basic carpentry, and animal husbandry and cooking and sewing and reading and writing, and a working knowledge of medicinal herbs that her mother had passed down to her. She had described herself plainly, not because she lacked vanity entirely, but because she had no patience for beginning something important with a false version of herself. She had brown hair and green eyes, and a face that was handsome rather than pretty and hands that showed their work. She was practical and direct, and not much given to ornamentation in her speech or her expectations. The registry had sent her 3 names. 2 of them she had exchanged a few letters with and found nothing that sparked in her, no sense of recognition, no feeling that the man on the other end of the correspondence was someone she could build a life beside. The 3rd name was Theodore Watkins of Harker County, Texas. His first letter had been 2 pages long and had made her laugh twice. Not with jokes exactly, but with a kind of dry, unsentimental honesty about the realities of frontier life that was such a direct contrast to the boastful letters the registry's other men tended to send that she had read it twice just to make sure she was not imagining the humor in it. He had described his property in terms that sounded exhausting and his days in terms that sounded lonely, and he had not once compared Texas to paradise or promised her that love and land and sunshine would solve everything. He had just described his actual life and said he was looking for someone who wanted to share it. She had written back within the week. Over the following 6 months, they had exchanged letters that grew longer and more personal as the weeks passed, moving from the careful formality of strangers trying to assess each other to something warmer and more complicated. He asked her about Missouri, and she told him things she had not spoken aloud to anyone since her mother died. She asked him about his past, and he told her some of it, carefully but honestly, the pieces she was to learn later he had chosen with great deliberation, giving her truth without giving her everything at once. What he had not given her was the truth about the homestead. His letters described a property that was, in his own words, holding on by its fingernails. He wrote about the struggle of maintaining a working farm alone, about the roof that had leaked through 2 wet seasons, about the fencing that kept failing in the south pasture, about the well that needed work and the barn that was half its former self after a lightning strike. He wrote about it not with self-pity but with the matter-of-fact tone of a man cataloging genuine problems that needed a genuine partner to solve. Ada had believed every word. She had agreed to come in early September of 1874, booking herself a stage from Missouri to the railhead in Abilene, and then a connecting stage south into Texas that had taken 3 days and rattled her bones in a way she felt for a week afterward. She had arrived in the town of Harker's Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in September with her carpetbag and her trunk and her practical green eyes and her honest hands, and she had hired the livery man to take her the 4 miles out to the Watkins homestead. And what she had found when she got there was not a property holding on by its fingernails. What she had found was a home that someone had loved into being with years of quiet, determined work. And now she was standing in his kitchen pressing her hands against his clean table and trying to understand why that felt like a betrayal and also, inconveniently, like the most unexpectedly moving thing anyone had ever done. Theodore appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was still holding his hat. He had the look of a man who was not going to offer an excuse but was prepared to offer an explanation, and there was a difference between those two things that Ada, who had been raised by a man who understood integrity, recognized immediately. "I should have told you the truth from the start," he said, "about the condition of the place. That's fair, and I'm not going to argue with you about it." "Then what are you going to do?" Ada asked. She did not sit down. She kept her hands on the table and her eyes on him. "I'm going to tell you why." He came into the kitchen and pulled out the chair across from her and sat in it, setting his hat on the table beside him, and he looked at her with those steady brown eyes that she had been trying to read since the moment she arrived. "My wife died 4 years ago. Her name was Margaret. She was 28 years old, and she died in childbed, and the child didn't survive either." Ada went very still. "I kept working the place after she was gone because stopping would have meant something I wasn't ready for it to mean. And I worked it harder than I had when she was alive because working hard was the only way I knew to keep the grief from eating me whole. So things got fixed that had been broken. Things got built that had been meant to be built. The roof got fixed. The fences got mended. The barn got rebuilt." He paused. "I wasn't lying about any of those things being wrong. They were wrong. I just fixed them before I wrote to you." "Then why describe them as though they were still broken?" "Because I was afraid," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete lack of pride-saving decoration around the word, stopped her cold. "Because the truth is that I wrote to the registry not because I needed someone to help me fix things, but because I had fixed things and I was sitting in a fixed house alone, and it was worse, somehow, than when the house had been broken. When things were broken, I had purpose. When I got things right, I just had the quiet." He looked down at his hat on the table for a moment. "I was afraid if I told you the truth, if I said, 'Come to a place that's already built, that's already good, come to a man who just wants a person to share it with. You'd think I was soft or lonely in a way that would put you off. So I let you think I needed the practical help. And I told myself it wasn't really a lie because you'd be able to see for yourself when you got here." Ada was quiet for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was going gold, the particular thick gold of a Texas September afternoon, and she could hear the chickens making their small, satisfied sounds, and she could smell the clean mineral smell of the well water and the faint sweetness of the late garden. "You were afraid I'd say no," she said. "Yes. If you had written to me and said, 'I have a good homestead and a decent life, and I am simply lonely and would like someone to share it with,' I would have said yes," Ada said. "I would have said yes immediately because that is honest and that is something a person can work with." Theodore looked up at her. Something shifted in his face, something that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of a different kind of pain. "I know that now." "You don't know anything about me yet," Ada said. "You know what's in those letters and I know what's in yours, and we have spent 6 months getting to know carefully selected versions of each other. We don't actually know each other." "No," he said, "we don't." "So," Ada said. She straightened up from the table and looked around the kitchen with those practical green eyes, and then she looked back at him. "I am here. I have come a long way to be here. I think that before I make any decision about whether I am going to stay or go back to Missouri, and what exactly I am going to do about the fact that the ground under my feet is not what I thought it was, we should at least try to have an honest conversation. An actually honest one. The kind we should have been having in the letters." Theodore stood up from the chair. He was very tall when he was standing, and Ada was not a small woman, but he made the kitchen feel different just by occupying his full height in it. "I can do that," he said. "I can do honest. It's what I should have been doing from the start." "Yes," Ada said, "it is." She looked at him for another moment, and he looked at her, and the kitchen settled around them with its smell of pine soap and the last of the afternoon light, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hopeless either. "Is there coffee?" she asked. Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. "There's coffee," he said. Theodore Watkins had been born in 1842 in central Tennessee to a farming family that had worked the same red clay land for 3 generations. He had grown up learning the rhythms of agricultural life, the way children learn to walk, through falls and corrections, and the slow accumulation of knowledge in the hands and the body rather than the head. He was 20 years old when the war began, and he had gone into it with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that marked most of his generation's approach to things they could not avoid. He had fought for the Confederacy, which was the cause of the county and the family he had grown up in, and he had spent 3 years in it before being wounded at Chickamauga in September of 1863. A bullet through the upper left arm that had left him with a scar he still carried, and a slight limitation in the range of motion that had never quite fully healed. He had recovered at a field hospital and been sent home and spent the last year and a half of the war on the farm, and when Lee surrendered in April of '65, Theodore had felt something complicated that he could not have named at the time and had come to understand only slowly over the years following. Not grief for the lost cause, which he had come to view with a clear eye, but grief for the men he had known who had died for it, which was a different thing entirely. He had come to Texas in 1867 with 160 acres of government land under a homestead claim, and the intention of building something new in a new place where the soil was not soaked in the history of what had happened. He had spent 2 years alone on the land before meeting Margaret Holloway in the town of Harker's Creek, a schoolteacher's daughter from Georgia, who had come west with her parents when her father took the county's new school position. She was 23 and he was 25, and they had been married within the year. Margaret had been the kind of person who made wherever she was immediately feel inhabited. She had put up the curtains and braided the rug and planted the garden and named all the chickens and organized the kitchen shelves with a systematic cheerfulness that Theodore had found both bewildering and deeply comforting. She had been with him for 3 years when the pregnancy went wrong in the autumn of 1870, and he had held her hand in the dark of the bedroom while the midwife did everything she could, and Margaret had gone quietly, which was not like her at all, and the child, a boy, had never taken his first breath. Theodore had kept the curtains up. He had kept the rug. He had kept the kitchen shelves organized the way Margaret had organized them. He had replanted the garden every spring in the same rows she had laid out. He had kept all of it, not because he was unable to move past it, but because he had come to understand that the way he honored her was to keep building what she had started, to make the place she had loved into the place it had always been meant to become. He was 32 years old when he wrote his first letter to the registry, and the homestead was everything it was because a woman he had loved had cared about it, and keeping it was his way of saying that caring about something mattered, that people who invested their hearts in something deserved to have that investment respected. He had not known how to explain any of that in a letter to a stranger, so he had described the things that had been wrong and let her fill in the gaps with assumptions. That first evening, over coffee that was strong and slightly bitter because he had not yet learned how she took it, Ada Fairchild told him the truth about herself in return. She told him about Missouri and her mother and Thomas and her father, all three of them gone in different ways by different griefs, and she told it without sentimentality, but with a plainness that was its own kind of honesty. She told him about the farm being mortgaged and the decision to go west, and the two other men from the registry whose letters had felt hollow, and the way his letter had been different, had felt like a real person talking rather than a performance of what a real person was supposed to sound like. She told him about the 6 months of letters and how they had felt like the beginning of something, like the careful clearing of ground before you plant, and how she had arrived on the stage from Missouri, genuinely believing she was coming to something half-broken that needed her, and how the shock of finding it whole and tended had knocked something loose in her that she was still in the process of putting back in order. "I think," she said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup and looking at him across the table in the failing light, because neither of them had thought to light the lamp and they had just kept talking as the afternoon became evening, and the evening pulled the color from the room, "that I was afraid too. I was afraid that if I came here to something good and whole and fine, I would feel like I had nothing to offer, that I was only valuable for what I could work and mend and build. That a man with a whole house didn't need me in the ways that mattered." Theodore was very quiet for a moment. "A whole house doesn't mean a whole life," he said. The lamp went unlit for another several minutes. Then Ada got up and found it and lit it herself, which seemed to him to say something important about who she was. She stayed. That first night she took the small room that had been a storage room before he had quietly, over the preceding weeks, cleared it out and put a proper bed frame in it with a good rope lattice and a mattress he had purchased from the dry goods store in Harker's Creek, and a quilt that had been his mother's. Ada slept in it and did not sleep well, the way a person sleeps in a new place when their mind is still sorting through everything it has encountered in the day. In the morning she got up before the light was fully established and went into the kitchen and found the coffee things and made coffee, and when Theodore came in from the morning chores, she handed him a cup without speaking, and he took it, and they both stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over the east pasture in a wash of orange and gold that made the dry September grass look briefly, impossibly beautiful. "I want to see the whole property," she said. "All right." He showed her everything. It took most of the morning. The south pasture where the fence had been his first major project after Margaret died, post by post by post, driven into the hard ground with a methodical grief that had exhausted his body each evening, and therefore allowed him to sleep. The well, which he had redug and relined with stone 2 years ago. The barn, rebuilt after the lightning strike of '69 into a structure that was sounder and more spacious than the original. The kitchen garden, which he had kept in Margaret's layout, but expanded over the years to include more of what he had learned through trial and error grew best in Harker County soil. The chicken coop, which he had built the year before last. The small workshop behind the barn where he kept his tools, organized with a precision that revealed a man who thought carefully about systems and efficiency. Ada walked through all of it with her practical eyes open and her mouth mostly closed, asking occasional specific questions about the soil composition and the water table and the rotation cycle of the crops, questions that revealed an agricultural knowledge he had not expected and that clearly surprised him. "My father farmed," she said when she noticed the surprise. "I worked beside him from the time I was old enough to be useful. I know what I'm looking at." She knew what she was looking at. What she was looking at was 160 acres of well-managed Texas land that had been tended with an attention to detail and a quality of sustained effort that spoke of genuine love, not just for the land, but for the idea of what the land could become. You could not maintain something this well through difficulty and grief and isolation unless you cared about it in a way that went beyond practical necessity. She stopped at the edge of the east field, where the dry late summer grass met a line of live oak trees that ran along a dry creek bed, and she stood looking at it for a long moment with the September wind moving her hair across her face, and Theodore stood beside her and did not rush her thinking. "You kept all of this," she said, not a question. "Yes." "Through 4 years alone." "Yes." Ada turned and looked at him, and he held her gaze with that steadiness that she was coming to recognize as one of his fundamental characteristics, the kind of man who does not look away from hard things. "Theodore," she said. "Ada. I think I understand what you did and why you did it," she said. "I'm not certain I can fully forgive the deception yet because I'm still untangling it. But I want you to know that I can see what this place is and what it took to make it this way, and I am not sorry I came." The relief that moved across his face was so genuine and so unguarded that it hit her somewhere in the center of her chest like a physical thing. "I'm not sorry either," he said. "I was sorry about the lie. I'm not sorry about you being here." They walked back to the house together in the warm, late morning light. The days that followed had a particular quality that Ada found hard to name at first and eventually settled on the word careful. They were careful with each other in the way of two people who have agreed to be honest, but are still learning where the boundaries of the other's privacy lie. They worked together during the days, because there was always work to do, and Ada was not a person who could sit idle, and she discovered quickly that she and Theodore had a natural working rhythm together that required less talking than she would have expected to navigate well. They moved around each other in the kitchen and the yard and the garden with a kind of unspoken coordination that felt, more than once, like something she had had before in a different life, something she had almost forgotten was possible. She learned his habits. He was up before full light every morning and in bed before the second hour after dark. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint but revealed clear preferences through enthusiasm. And she learned that he had a particular weakness for cornbread made with a little extra lard that made the crust crackle, and for any kind of dried fruit cooked down into a thick sweet paste that he would spread on said cornbread with unself-conscious pleasure. He hummed when he worked alone, wordless tunes she could not always identify, low and quiet, like a man comforting himself. He read in the evenings, the Bible and a handful of agricultural pamphlets and a dog-eared copy of the Count of Monte Cristo that he had read. She eventually learned, 4 times. He learned her habits too. She came back from being out of doors with her hair always needing repinning, and she never seemed to notice until she put her hand up to it in surprise, as though encountering it for the first time. She had opinions about the proper way to do nearly everything, and she expressed these opinions with the directness of someone who had never learned to soften a practical observation into a social pleasantry, which occasionally startled him, but which he quickly came to appreciate because it meant he always knew where he stood with her. She talked to the chickens. Not the way some people did, the way people talk to animals in a fond but performative way, but in actual low informational tones, as though keeping them apprised of the day's events. He did not mention this to her directly for 2 weeks, and then one morning he said, as she came in from the coop, "What did you tell them today?" She looked at him, reading his face for mockery and finding none. "That the weather is turning and they should not be surprised by it," she said. He nodded seriously. "Good that they know," she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a real laugh, not a polite smile or a quick breath of amusement, but a genuine laugh that involved her whole face and lasted several seconds, and the effect of it on him was something he had not anticipated and spent the rest of the morning quietly absorbing. There was a morning in the second week when everything nearly fell apart. The postmaster from Harker's Creek came out in a wagon with a letter that had been following Ada from Missouri through the registry's forwarding address. A letter from the man who held the mortgage on her father's farm, a Mr. Clarence Avery, who had now sold the farm, and wished to notify her that the sale had also included the disposition of her father's personal effects, the books and the tools and the small items that Ada had not taken with her, and that if she wished to claim any of it, she would need to present herself in Callaway County within 30 days. Ada read the letter on the porch with Theodore standing in the yard watching her face, which he had learned to read over the preceding days and which was now telling him something was wrong. She put the letter down on the porch rail and looked out at the east pasture for a long time. "My father's tools," she said. "His Bible. His wife's ring, which he kept in a box on the mantelpiece after she died, and which I should have taken when I left, but I was in such a hurry to get out of that place and away from the grief of it that I didn't think." Her voice stopped. She pressed her lips together hard. Theodore came up onto the porch and stood beside her without touching her, because he had learned already that Ada Fairchild processed difficulty in silence before she was ready for any kind of comfort, and rushing that process was a trespass. After a minute she said, "I can't go back, not in 30 days. The stage alone would cost more than I have, and by the time I got there and back, I can write to the postmaster in Fulton," Theodore said. "Explain the situation. Ask if the items can be held or shipped." He paused. "I have some funds put by. We could cover the freight." Ada turned and looked at him with those green eyes that were bright and dry, because she was not a woman who cried easily, but there was something raw in them that made his chest feel tight. "You don't owe me that," she said. "I know I don't," he said. "I want to do it." Something in her face shifted, the way ground shifts when the earth settles after rain, moving toward a new stability. "All right," she said. "We'll write the letter." They wrote it together at the kitchen table that evening, Ada dictating and Theodore writing in his careful, deliberate hand. And the letter was clear and specific, and asked for exactly what was needed without excessive sentiment. They sent it out the next morning with the postmaster, who was a talkative man named Henderson, whose opinion of Theodore Watkins's character was evidently high enough that he took the letter with a kind of approving gravity that suggested he understood what was happening here and thought well of it. The items arrived 3 weeks later in a wooden crate packed with newspaper. Her father's Bible, the tools, the ring, which was a simple gold band worn thin from 30 years of wear, and several other small things Ada had not expected. A photograph of her parents taken in the early years of their marriage. A small carved wooden bird that had been a toy of Ada's childhood that she had forgotten existed. A bundle of letters tied with brown string that she sat with for a long time one evening while Theodore was in the workshop, reading in the lamplight and being very quiet. He left her to it. He left her to all of it, which was precisely the right thing. The town of Harker's Creek was a modest establishment of perhaps 300 souls in the fall of 1874. A main street with the general store and the dry goods and the barber shop and the land office and the post and the church. 2 saloons of varying repute, a livery stable, a small hotel, and the school where Margaret's father had once taught, and where a young man named Griggs now held the position. There was a blacksmith, a doctor who was technically a veterinarian but handled human cases when no other option was available, and a small but lively community of families who had been building their lives in Harker County for the better part of a decade. Theodore brought Ada into town for the first time 3 weeks after her arrival, needing supplies and wanting, though he would not have said this directly, to establish her presence in the community in a way that made her situation unambiguous. He was not a man who gave much weight to gossip, but he was also a man who understood that a woman living on a man's property without clear social definition was a woman left vulnerable to the interpretations of others, and he was not willing to leave Ada vulnerable to anything he could prevent. They walked into Henderson's general store together, and Henderson, who was behind the counter and who already knew a great deal about Ada from the letter and from the subsequent deliveries, greeted them with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "Miss Fairchild," he said, "it's good to put a face to the correspondence. Theodore's spoken well of you." Ada glanced at Theodore, who was examining a display of hardware with what appeared to be great concentration. "Has he?" she said. "He has," Henderson confirmed, and the smile he was suppressing was entirely visible. They went through the supply list together, and Ada contributed additions and modifications to the order that revealed such a specific and practical knowledge of homestead management that Henderson twice paused to look at Theodore with an expression that said clearly that the man had done something right in bringing this particular woman to Harker County, whatever the circumstances. They had coffee at the hotel after, in the small room off the lobby that served as a sitting room for paying guests and visiting farmers alike. A woman named Clara Reese, whose husband ran the livery, came in while they were there and was introduced to Ada and immediately made the kind of assessment of her that a practical frontier woman makes of another, which was swift and thorough, and Ada could tell, reasonably favorable. Clara Reese had 4 children and the kind of no-nonsense warmth that came from having survived considerable difficulty with her humor intact. She sat with them for 20 minutes and talked about the county, about the particularly rough winter of '72, about the cattle drives that came through in the spring, and the particular problems they caused for anyone with a kitchen garden situated near the main trail, about the Comanche raids that had troubled the region through the late '60s and early '70s, and had quieted since the Red River War of the prior year, but left a wariness in the older settlers that ran beneath the surface of every casual conversation about distances and weather. Ada listened to all of it with the focused attention of a woman cataloging essential information about a new place, and asked the questions that needed asking, and by the end of the 20 minutes, Clara Reese had decided she approved of Ada Fairchild, and said so in the direct way of someone who does not see the point of making approval a mystery. "You'll do well here," she said, "and Theodore could use someone who says what she means." Theodore, who had been saying nothing during this entire exchange, and had the look of a man who has accepted that some conversations proceed better without his participation, simply nodded. Walking back to the wagon in the afternoon heat, Ada said quietly without looking at him, "You've been talking about me in town." "I mentioned you to Henderson when I arranged for the crate to be received," Theodore said. "I told him your name and that you had come from Missouri and that I hoped you would be staying." He paused. "I didn't say anything that wasn't true." Ada considered this. "No," she said, "I suppose you didn't." It was on the wagon ride home, 4 miles of dry Texas road through the scrub and mesquite, that something began to change between them in a way that was harder to map than the earlier changes, which had been about trust and its rebuilding. This was something different. This was the territory that lay on the far side of trust, the territory you could not enter until the ground was solid enough to hold the weight of it. Theodore was driving, and Ada was sitting beside him on the wagon board with the afternoon sun on her face and the wind moving the loose pieces of her hair, and she said, out of a silence that had been comfortable for several miles, "Tell me about Margaret." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily on the road. "She was bright," he said. "Genuinely bright in the way where she could hold a lot of things in her mind at once and see how they connected. She was funny, funnier than me." She had opinions about everything, and she argued them with a cheerfulness that made it hard to stay annoyed even when she was wrong. He paused again. She was the one who decided we needed to repaint the barn. I thought white was excessive, and she said excessive was the point of having something to look at every morning when you walk outside. She was right, Ada said. She was right about most things. He glanced at her from the side. I want you to know I'm not talking to you about her because I think you need to compete with her or measure up to her. I'm talking about her because she was a real person who mattered, and pretending otherwise would be another kind of lie. Ada looked at the road ahead. I appreciate that, she said. I wouldn't want to live in a house where someone had been loved and have that love be treated as a secret. No secrets, Theodore said. We agreed. We agreed, Ada confirmed. The horses moved on through the scrub, and the light got longer and the shadows stretched out ahead of them toward home. There was a night in late September when a storm came in from the north with very little warning, the kind of sharp early storm that sometimes ran ahead of the actual season change, bringing cold and wind and horizontal rain. Theodore was in the barn securing the animals when the worst of it hit, and Ada was in the house banking the fire and doing the practical work of storm preparation that she knew without being told. Closing the shutters, moving the rain barrel under the eave, checking that the cellar door was properly latched. When he came in from the barn 20 minutes later, he was soaked through and carrying a chill that had turned his lips faintly blue at the edges, and Ada looked at him and said nothing except, "Sit down," in the tone of a woman who has made a practical decision and is not interested in negotiation. She heated water for coffee, and she went to the chest at the foot of his bed where he kept spare blankets, and she brought one out and handed it to him. And while he was getting dry clothes and changing behind the curtained doorway, she made the coffee and set it on the table with the cornbread she had made that morning. When he came back out, he sat down and wrapped his hands around the coffee, and she sat across from him. And they sat in the warmth of the fire with the storm battering the shutters and the rain hammering the good tin roof he had put on 3 years ago. And outside the wind was trying to get in but could not, because the house had been made to keep wind out. "This is a good house," Ada said. "It is now," Theodore said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, the warm light of it moving across his face, and he looked very tired and very calm in the way of a man who is sitting in a place that is fundamentally his and knows it. "Theodore," she said. He turned and looked at her. "I think I would like to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, I could go somewhere else. But because I think this is a place worth staying in, and I think," she stopped for a moment, finding the words, "I think you are someone worth knowing more of." The fire popped and sent a small shower of sparks against the grate. "Is that—" he stopped, started again. "Are you saying that you want to—" "I am saying," Ada said, with the precision of a woman who has thought carefully about what she means, "that I would like us to have the honest conversation about whether this is going somewhere, and if it is, to let it go there, and if it is not, to say so now while the honest saying of it is still the right thing to do." Theodore set his coffee down. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes that she had spent 6 weeks reading and was only beginning to fully understand. "Ada," he said, "I wrote 6 months of letters to you. I fixed everything there was to fix in this house before I wrote to you because I wanted to give you something whole to come to. I drove into Harker's Creek and told Henderson your name with the kind of feeling that made him look at me like I'd said something embarrassing without meaning to. I have been sitting across this table from you for 3 weeks trying to be patient when what I actually want—" He stopped. He looked at his hands and then back at her. "What I actually want is for you to be here. Not just as someone who is staying, as someone who belongs here." The storm was loud outside. Inside, the kitchen was very warm. Ada reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and the warmth of her hand over his was such a specific and grounded thing, after all the months of letters and distance and careful navigation, that he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that while the storm moved through. It was not yet a declaration of everything. It was the beginning of one. But beginnings, as Ada had known since the morning she had decided to go west instead of staying in Missouri and making do, were the only things that led anywhere worth going. In the first week of October, Theodore proposed to her. He did it in the kitchen in the morning, standing at the stove with his back to her in a way that she later understood was because he was nervous, and looking at her directly while he was nervous was too much, and he said, "Ada, I would like very much for you to marry me if that is something you want. There is no pressure in the asking. If you need more time, I will give you more time." Ada was sitting at the table drinking coffee, and she said, "Turn around, Theodore. I'm not answering a man who's talking to the stove." He turned around. He was holding a spatula, and he looked both hopeful and terrified in equal measure. "Yes," Ada said, "I want to marry you." He set the spatula down. "That was very fast. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks," she said. "I just wanted you to ask." They were married in the Harkers Creek Church on the 14th of October, 1874, in the presence of Reverend Marsh, who had a long white beard and an approving manner, and Henderson the postmaster and his wife Ruth, and Clara Reese and her husband Frank, and a handful of other county families who had heard the story of the woman from Missouri who had come to the Watkins homestead, and who attended out of genuine goodwill rather than social obligation. Ada wore her second-best dress, which was a deep blue wool that matched the October sky, with her hair pinned up properly for once, and Theodore wore a black coat that was clearly his best and clearly not worn often, and they stood in front of Reverend Marsh and said the words that needed saying with a simple seriousness that made Clara Reese, who was not a sentimental woman by any conventional measure, press her handkerchief briefly to the corner of her eye. After the ceremony, Henderson's wife Ruth produced a considerable quantity of food from somewhere, the community having organized itself around the event in the way of frontier communities that understand that celebrations are essential and rare, and they ate and talked in the church's small yard in the warm October afternoon, until the light went and the night came cool and clean around them. On the walk back to where the wagon was tied, with the sounds of the town behind them fading into the night, Ada took Theodore's arm and held it with both her hands and leaned slightly against him as they walked, the first purely uncalculated physical gesture she had made toward him since her arrival, and he put his other hand over hers and held it there, and they walked in silence that needed nothing added to it. The winter of 1874 and 1875 was the first winter Ada had not dreaded in years. There was something about having someone else in the house with you, not just another body but a specific person whose presence you had chosen and who had chosen yours, that changed the character of winter entirely. The cold and the long evenings that would have been lonely became companionable. The work that cold weather made harder was easier for being shared. They learned each other more fully through those months. Theodore taught her the particular characteristics of Harker County soil and how he had learned to manage it over the years, the specific amendments and rotations that had improved his yields. Ada taught him her mother's herb medicine and how to use what grew wild in the county for what purposes, knowledge that he received with a respect and attentiveness that made it clear he understood its practical value. She began working on an expansion of the kitchen garden, planning for the spring, drawing it out on paper at the kitchen table in the evenings while he read, the two of them quiet together in the lamplight with the fire going, and the wind outside doing whatever wind did, and neither of them minding very much. He was not an effusive man, Theodore, not given to large declarations or romantic speeches, but he had a way of showing care through action that Ada, who had grown up in a household where love was expressed through doing rather than saying, understood completely and valued more than she could easily articulate. He noticed when she was tired and made the coffee without being asked. He fixed the latch on the storage room door that had been sticking without her mentioning it twice. He came in from the south pasture one afternoon in November with a handful of late autumn wildflowers, dried and sparse but still carrying their color, and put them in a jar on the kitchen windowsill without explanation or ceremony. And when she asked him about it, he said he had seen them and thought she might like them. And that was the whole of it. One January evening, a blizzard came through that dropped temperatures well below freezing and kept them both inside for 3 days. They played cards, which Ada had learned from her father and which she was considerably better at than Theodore, a fact he accepted with good grace and only mild indignation. They talked for hours, covering the ground of their pasts more fully than they had managed to in the busy working months, going into the corners and the difficult sections, the things that were not easy to tell but that needed to be told if two people were going to fully know each other. He told her the things he had held back in the letters, the full weight of the grief after Margaret, the months when he had questioned whether continuing to maintain the homestead was reasonable or merely a form of stubbornness, dressed up as purpose, the night in the second winter when he had stood in the doorway of the barn in the cold and looked at the property he had built and felt its quality as an accusation rather than an achievement, and had decided, quietly and alone, that he was going to make it something so fine and complete that, when the right person arrived, there would be no question that it had been worth the keeping. Ada told him about the years of caregiving, first her mother and then Thomas and then her father, the long, slow cost of watching the people you love disappear, and about how she had sometimes feared, in the middle of those years, that she had confused herself so entirely with the people she was taking care of that she had forgotten what she wanted for herself, and how the letters to the registry had been, in part, an experiment in finding out whether she was still a person with her own desires or whether she had been completely absorbed into the service of others. And, Theodore said, he was on his side of the fire with his book closed in his lap and his eyes on her. "And I still know what I want," Ada said. "I'm here, aren't I?" Spring came, and with it the work of the kitchen garden expansion, which Ada threw herself into with an energy that delighted and slightly alarmed Theodore, who was not accustomed to someone approaching soil work with what could only be described as enthusiasm bordering on joy. She had planned for the expansion through the winter months and had ordered several seed varieties from a catalog she had found in the dry goods, and she executed the plan with a systematic precision that produced, by June, a garden considerably larger and more productive than the one she had inherited. She also introduced herself to the properties of the local plant life with a methodical thoroughness that became known, over the spring and summer months, in Harker's Creek. Clara Reese's youngest had a persistent cough that the veterinarian doctor had been treating without much success, and Ada made a preparation from wild thyme and mullein that she had gathered from the creek bank and dried through the winter, and the cough improved within the week. This was noted. Other small consultations followed, quietly and without Ada advertising herself, because she was a practical woman and not given to performance. But the word got around in the way that words get around in small communities, and by midsummer she had become a person that the women of Harker County came to for a specific kind of help. She and Theodore were careful and happy and growing more certain of each other with each season that passed. The happiness did not come without its difficulties, because happiness and difficulty are not mutually exclusive, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not been paying attention. There were arguments, genuine ones, about property decisions and the management of money, and once, memorably, about the proper method for preserving tomatoes, an argument that lasted 2 days and ended in a compromise that Ada later admitted was slightly superior to her original position, though she maintained that his method had benefited significantly from her modifications. There was a harder disagreement in the spring of 1875, when a man named Griggs, who had replaced Margaret's father at the school, came to Theodore with a proposition about a piece of the south pasture that sat adjacent to the county road, suggesting that Theodore might sell the strip and use the money to purchase cattle that would improve the homestead's income. Theodore had been considering it. Ada thought it was wrong, Not wrong as a financial calculation, but wrong in a different way that took her some time to articulate precisely. What she finally said was, "You have kept every inch of this place. You have kept it and built it and not sold a single piece of it, and I understand why, and I think the reason matters, and we should not start selling pieces of it now because someone makes an offer that sounds reasonable. Land you sell, you don't get back." He looked at her for a long time. "That's Margaret's garden plot you're standing near," he said. "I know it is," Ada said. "I planted in it this spring." Something moved between them in that moment that was not about the land, or was about the land in a way that included everything the land meant, which was Margaret and grief and 4 years of stubbornness, and a woman from Missouri who had arrived expecting a broken homestead and found something whole and had decided to become a part of it. Theodore did not sell the strip. Griggs was politely refused. The south pasture remained intact. In late August of 1875, Ada told Theodore that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, matter-of-factly in the kitchen, because she was not a woman who dramatized, but her face when she told him was open in a way she could not have hidden even if she had tried. He stood very still for a moment. Then he covered the distance between them and put his hands on her face and looked at her with an expression that contained so many things at once that she could not catalog them all. And he said her name, just her name, and she put her hands over his hands and held them there. "Are you frightened?" he asked. He meant because of what had happened to Margaret, and they both knew he meant it, and she honored the asking by taking it seriously. "Yes," she said honestly. "A little, but not so much that I'm not also very happy." He held her face in his hands for another moment, and then he kissed her forehead, which was tender and careful and exactly what she needed from him right then, and they stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming in and the garden outside visible through the window, growing toward harvest. The pregnancy went well. Ada was healthy and strong and practical about it, which was to say she did not stop working, but she was sensible about what she did and did not do. And Clara Reese came by frequently, and was a source of reassuring practical knowledge that Ada received gratefully. The doctor who handled human cases, Dr. Albright, who had actually had some genuine medical training in addition to his veterinary practice, visited twice and was satisfied with her progress. Theodore was attentive without being hovering, which was precisely the calibration Ada required. He did more of the heavier physical work without being asked, and without making a point of it. He had read, in the preceding months, both a medical text on obstetrics that he had purchased from a bookseller in San Antonio by mail order, and every pamphlet on the subject that the county's small library could produce, and he had done this quietly and without telling Ada until she found the books, at which point he looked mildly embarrassed, and she looked at him with an expression that was so warm it made the embarrassment irrelevant. "You ordered a medical text," she said. "I wanted to know what to expect," he said, "in case. I wanted to be useful." Ada was quiet for a moment, holding the book. "Theodore," she said, "you are the most quietly thorough person I have ever known." "Is that good?" "Yes," she said. "That is very good." Their son was born on a cold, clear morning in the first week of May, 1876, delivered by Dr. Albright with Clara Reese and Theodore both present, Ada having very firmly refused to be put in a separate room from her husband for the duration, a position that Dr. Albright had initially protested and then, faced with Ada's completely immovable calm on the subject, accepted. Theodore held her hand through all of it and was the first thing she looked at when it was over, and what she saw in his face in that moment was worth every difficult thing she had ever gone through to arrive at it. The boy was healthy and loud and had Theodore's dark hair and Ada's green eyes, a combination that Clara Reese pronounced extraordinary, and that Theodore spent a considerable amount of time simply looking at with an expression that Ada found impossible to fully look at directly because it was too full of something too large to look at straight on. They named him Elias, after Ada's father. Theodore did not suggest the name. Ada did. And he received it with a quiet gravity that told her He understood exactly what it cost her to offer that name as a gift, and exactly what kind of gratitude he owed her for it. Elias Watkins was a vigorous infant who grew into an energetic toddler with a strong will that both his parents recognized as their own and could not therefore entirely object to, even when it manifested as a firm refusal to go to sleep at any reasonable hour. He had the particular childhood freedom of a child raised on a working homestead, which meant he was underfoot and observant and learning everything at once. And by the time he was 2, he had definite opinions about the chickens and could name all 12 of them with reasonable accuracy. In the spring of 1878, Ada was expecting again. This pregnancy was quieter than the first, which concerned her until Dr. Albright assured her that quiet was sometimes simply quiet. She delivered in October of that year, a girl this time, small and dark-eyed and fierce in the way of certain people who arrive in the world already decided about things. They named her Ruth, after Henderson's wife, who had fed half the county at the wedding and who had become, in the years since, one of Ada's closest friends. Ruth Watkins was different from her brother in temperament, quieter and more watchful, and more like Theodore in the way she absorbed things before she spoke about them. But she had Ada's particular form of stubbornness, the kind that is so quietly absolute that you sometimes don't realize you have encountered an immovable object until you have already been thoroughly stopped. The homestead had expanded by this point. A second bedroom added off the back of the house in the year before Elias was born, and now with 2 children it felt appropriately full in the way that homes are supposed to feel, the comfortable, organized fullness of a life that is genuinely being lived in a place. Theodore had purchased a second team of horses and was farming a greater portion of the property than in the early years. And Ada's kitchen garden had grown into something that supplied not just the household but a regular surplus that she took into Harker's Creek and sold or traded with a matter-of-fact practicality that added considerably to the household income. She had also formalized, in a modest and unofficial way, the herbal medicine practice that had grown organically from her early interventions, and while she was careful to describe herself only as a woman with traditional knowledge rather than a practitioner of any formal kind, the women of the county knew where to come and came regularly. Henderson had been re-elected postmaster for the 4th consecutive time. Clara Reese's children were growing up fast. The town had a second church now and a proper schoolhouse, and Elias was going to be old enough for school in another year. On a September evening in 1879, 5 years after Ada had stepped off the stage in Harker's Creek with her carpetbag and her practical eyes and her honest hands, she and Theodore sat on the porch in the long evening light watching Elias chase Ruthie around the yard with a stick he had designated a sword, and the chickens ignored both children with their usual philosophical calm, and the smell of the late garden came up on the warm air. And Ada had her feet up on the porch railing and Theodore was beside her in the other chair, and they were drinking coffee that was properly made now because they had had 5 years to learn each other's preferences. "I want to tell you something," Ada said. Theodore looked at her. He always looked at her with his full attention, which was one of the things about him she had loved the longest and most consistently. "When I came here," she said, "I had built up in my mind a very clear picture of what I was coming to. A place that needed saving, a man who needed saving, a situation where I would be valuable and necessary, and where I was coming to do something rather than just be somewhere. And when I arrived and it wasn't that, when the house was whole and the fence was straight and there were curtains in the windows, I felt something I couldn't identify for a long time." "What was it?" Theodore asked. "I was ashamed," Ada said. "Not of you. Not of your deception, though I was angry about that. I was ashamed because I realized that the picture I had built was partly about making sure I had something to offer, partly about making sure that the only way I was worth something in this new situation was if there was something broken that needed me to fix it. And when everything was already whole, I didn't know how to value myself except as a repair." Theodore was very still. "What changed?" he asked quietly. "You did," Ada said. "Or I understood you differently. Because you kept this place whole for someone worth keeping it for, not because you needed someone to fix it, but because you thought the right person deserved something that was already good. And that changed the question. Instead of, what can I offer to something broken, the question became, am I someone who deserves something good?" "Ada," Theodore said. "I know the answer now," she said. "I'm telling you so you know I know it." He reached over and took her hand, the same way she had taken his that night of the first storm, covering it with warmth that was specific and grounded and real. "You have been the best thing in my life since the morning you walked past me into my own kitchen and told me you needed to think," he said. "And you were the best thing in it before that, in those letters that were the most interesting reading I had had in years. And you will go on being the best thing in it, Ada, I suspect for as long as I'm alive to have a best thing." The children came running up to the porch, Elias with his stick and Ruthie 2 steps behind him with the look of someone who is going to win this competition by a method that hasn't been announced yet. "Mama," Elias said, "Ruthie says chickens can understand what we're saying." "They can," Ada said, without hesitation. Elias looked at his father. Theodore looked entirely serious. "Your mother knows more about chickens than either of us," he said. "I'd take her word for it." Elias considered this, accepted it with the practical pragmatism of a child who has learned that his parents are usually right, and ran back into the yard. Ruthie followed him with the serene confidence of someone who has already won. Ada and Theodore sat in the evening light and held hands and drank their coffee, and the homestead settled around them in the long, warm September evening, complete and tended, and full of the evidence of every year they had built into it. In the spring of 1881, their third child arrived, a second boy they named Samuel, red-haired and loud from the very first moment, in a way that Elias and Ruth had not been, filling the house with a different energy that Elias, now 5, received with the cautious fascination of an older sibling who is not entirely sure what to make of this new development, but is prepared to be interested. Clara Reese's oldest daughter had married one of the Harker County rancher's sons and moved to a property 2 miles south, which meant Clara and Ada were closer than ever. Henderson had finally persuaded his wife Ruth to let him add a second room to the post office, which was now essentially a small general reading room as well, where Ada brought books she had finished, and which the county's residents borrowed with a casualness that suggested they had all been waiting for someone to make this happen, without quite getting around to organizing it themselves. Theodore had, in the intervening years, become a man the county came to for advice on soil management, not formally but in the way that expertise becomes known, the way people learn who knows things and begin appearing on that person's porch with questions. He handled these consultations with his characteristic unhurried thoroughness, and Ada watched him on these occasions with a particular kind of admiration that had grown steadily over the years rather than diminishing. He still hummed when he worked alone. She still talked to the chickens. These habits had not changed. Elias had been going to the new schoolhouse for 2 years and had his father's memory and his mother's directness and the particular confidence of a child who has been taught that his opinions matter and his questions deserve real answers. He had taken a great interest in the management of the property in the way that children of farming families do, absorbing it through presence and participation, and Theodore taught him with the same quiet thoroughness with which he approached everything. Ruth had taken to books the way she took to most things, with absolute dedication and minimal fuss. She read everything she could find and remembered all of it, and had at age 5 already demonstrated that she was going to be an intellectually formidable person, which Ada found deeply satisfying and Theodore found both wonderful and slightly daunting. Samuel, at 1 year old, had no established intellectual reputation yet, but he had a laugh that could fill a room and a fascination with the horses that required constant supervision. In the autumn of 1882, Theodore and Ada sat on the porch one evening after the children were in bed, and Theodore said, "I want to show you something," and led her into the barn where, by the light of the lantern he carried, he showed her what he had been working on in the back corner of the workshop for the preceding several months. It was a chair. A proper rocking chair, made from the good Texas oak that he had been curing for 2 years in the workshop, shaped and joined with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who had taken considerable trouble, the joints tight and smooth, the proportions exactly right for Ada's particular height, and the way she sat. He had carved a small repeating pattern into the back rail, a simple pattern of wheat and wildflower that referenced both the Missouri she had come from and the Texas she had come to. Ada looked at it for a long time in the lamplight. "The rocking chair I had was Margaret's," Theodore said. "I think you should have something that's yours." Ada touched the back rail with her fingers, tracing the carved pattern. "When did you start this?" she asked. "Before Samuel was born," he said, "when I knew you'd need something comfortable." She turned and looked at him in the lamplight, and what was in her face was something that could not be named with a single word, because it was everything she felt about him gathered into one moment, the whole of the 8 years they had spent building this life together. The letters and the arrival and the confrontation and the forgiveness and the storm and the wedding and the children and the arguments and the quiet evenings and the coffee and the garden and everything that had happened in between. "Theodore Watkins," she said. "Ada Watkins," he said. She went to him and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the barn in the lamplight for a long moment, the sounds of the horses and the night outside and the warm smell of wood shavings and hay and the life they had built together all around them. "I love you," she said. She had said it before. She said it often, with the frequency and ease of someone who has understood that love is not diminished by being expressed, but is, in fact, confirmed and deepened each time you say it truly. "I love you," he said. He said it back every time, and every time meant every time. On the porch later, with the lantern out and the stars very bright over Harker County, they sat in their 2 chairs, hers new and his the older one, and Ada said, "I want to go back." He looked at her. "Not to stay," she said, "to visit Missouri, to see the farm or what it is now, and to put flowers on the graves if they'll let me, and to take the children to see where I came from." "Next spring," Theodore said without hesitation. "We can make the trip in the spring. You'd come." "Ada," he said, with the patient exasperation of a man addressing a question he finds slightly absurd, "where else would I be?" They made the trip in the spring of 1883. The whole family, Theodore and Ada and Elias at 7, and Ruth at 5, and Samuel at 2, traveling by train from the railhead in Abilene, which was a considerable adventure in itself, and which Samuel treated as a personal entertainment provided for his benefit. Elias asked questions for the entire journey, about the engine and the tracks and the geography of the country they moved through, and Theodore answered all of them with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to every question his son asked. Missouri was changed. The farm was under different ownership. A family from Indiana who had made improvements Ada found interesting and changes she found questionable, and who were, when she appeared at the door with 3 children and a tall, quiet husband, bewildered but not unwelcoming. She walked the fields she had walked all her life, and she stood at her parents' graves in the churchyard, and she introduced Elias to the headstones of his grandfather and great-grandmother with a steady voice and clear eyes. Elias stood in front of Ada Fairchild's grave marker with the solemn seriousness that he brought to important things. "He was a farmer," he said. "He was," Ada said. "Like Papa." "Yes," Ada said. "Like your papa." Theodore had his hand on Elias' shoulder, and he looked at Ada over their son's head, and what was in that look was the whole of what they were to each other, partners in this life they had chosen and built and continued to build, the living and the dead both included in it, the past neither erased nor imprisoned by what had come after. They came home to Texas in the late spring, the homestead waiting for them as it always did, the garden coming in well without them because Clara Reese had agreed to water it in their absence, the chickens placid in their coop, the white barn shining in the afternoon sun against the blue Texas sky, exactly as Margaret had decided it should be, and Ada had preserved and Theodore had maintained, and the years had confirmed as right. The summer of 1883 was a good summer. The harvest was one of the best they had had, and Theodore's reputation in the county had grown to the point where he was asked to speak at a county gathering about soil management, which he did in his characteristic way, saying precisely what needed to be said and not a word more. Ada sat in the audience with Samuel on her lap and watched her husband address 30 farming families with the quiet authority of a man who has earned what he knows. And she thought, not for the first time, that she was very glad she had not gone back to Missouri after that first day, very glad she had stayed in the kitchen and demanded honest coffee and an honest conversation. By the following year, Elias was deep in his studies at the schoolhouse, and Ruth had formed an alliance with the teacher's daughter that seemed to be equal parts intellectual partnership and general conspiracy. Samuel had graduated from fascination with the horses to fascination with the workshop, and followed Theodore into it every chance he got, which Theodore handled with a patience that Ada found both touching and unsurprising. One evening in the autumn of 1884, 10 years after Ada had first arrived with her carpetbag at the door of the homestead, they sat on the porch in the long October light, the children inside at various activities, and Ada said, "Do you remember what I said to you when I arrived?" "You said I lied to you," Theodore said. "In every letter. I did say that. You were right." "About the lying," Ada said. "I was right about the lying, but I was wrong about what I was angry about. I thought I was angry about the deception, and I was a little, but what I was really feeling was something closer to being overwhelmed." He looked at her. "Overwhelmed by what?" Ada looked at the east pasture in the long gold October light. "By the evidence of you," she said. "By what it meant that you had kept all of this. I had come expecting something broken, something that needed me for practical reasons, something I could manage with my hands and my skills and my work ethic. And what I found was that you had been keeping this place beautiful because you believed the right person deserved something beautiful. And that was," she paused. "That was not what I had been taught to expect." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "What had you been taught to expect?" "That love was practical," she said. "That it was made of necessity and mutual benefit and hard work. That romance was for novels and idle women, and that real life was about getting by." She looked at him. "My parents loved each other. I know they did, but I never saw them say it easily. It was always underneath the practical things, hidden in the work and the managing and the carrying on. I didn't know love could be." She gestured at the homestead, the whole of it, the barn and the garden and the curtains she could see through the window and the good wooden floor and the children inside, and the chair he had made her, and 10 years of morning coffee and honest conversation. "This," she said, "I didn't know it could be a thing you kept for someone and made beautiful and chose every day." Theodore reached over and took her hand. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know either," he said finally. "Not until you arrived and got angry at me for it and told me you needed to think, and I watched you walk into my kitchen with your back straight and your bag in your hand, and I thought, that is the most honest person I have ever seen in my life. And whatever happened next, I was going to spend the rest of my life earning the right to know her." Ada turned her head and looked at him. This man she had built 10 years with, who hummed when he worked and made careful plans and had kept a beautiful homestead for someone he had not yet met and had been right in the end to keep it, and who loved her in the way she had not known to expect, which was completely and carefully and with his full attention every ordinary day. "You earned it," she said. He smiled at her, the slow, full smile that she had learned over a decade to love completely. "You make it easy," he said. The October evening settled around them, Harker County going gold and then amber, and then the deep blue of early dark, the stars beginning their nightly work overhead, and inside the house Elias' voice, rose in some question, and Ruth's voice answered it with the brisk certainty of the family's authority on most subjects. And Samuel made some sound that was probably not a problem, and the homestead held all of it, the way it had been holding things since Margaret had put up the first curtains. The way it would go on holding things as long as someone loved it enough to keep it, which was going to be a very long time. Ada Fairchild, who had come to Texas expecting a broken homestead and found instead the truest thing she had never thought to look for, leaned her head against her husband's shoulder in the gathering dark and listened to the sound of her children and the sound of the night and the sound of the life she had chosen. And she was, with a completeness that she felt all the way down to the bedrock of herself, exactly where she was supposed to be. Elias came to the door. "Mama, Ruth says the chickens dream." "They do," Ada said. "Come sit with us for a minute." He came and sat on the porch step, and then Ruth appeared behind him and sat beside him. And a moment later Theodore rose and went inside and came back with Samuel on his hip, drowsy and warm. And he sat back down beside Ada and handed her the boy, and Samuel settled against her with the complete trust of the very young. And the five of them sat on the porch of the homestead in the October dark under the Texas stars, the living and the loved and the kept. And it was a complete and finished thing, a whole thing, a thing worth every mile and every letter and every honest conversation it had taken to arrive at. And the white barn gleamed in the starlight exactly the way Margaret had wanted it to, and the curtains hung pale in the dark windows, and the garden was put to bed for the winter, and the fence posts were straight, and the water pump was sound, and everything that had ever needed keeping was kept.